The blizzard came without warning. By late evening, the wind howled through the empty streets of Velnyorsk, a forgotten town deep in the Russian countryside. Snow piled high against shop doors, and most lights had gone out long before nightfall. Inside my small roadside diner, Masha's hearth, the dim glow of a single bulb flickered over the worn red booths and chipped counters. I had just finished cleaning the last plate when I heard the rumble of an engine struggling against the snow. Moments later, the front door burst open, letting in a gust of freezing air and a man. He stood there for a moment, brushing snow from his heavy black coat. His presence filled the little room. Tall, sharp-featured, eyes as cold as the storm outside. "Are you still open?" he asked in a low, impatient voice, his Russian thick with a Moscow accent. "Yes, barely," I replied, forcing a smile. "The storm's closing everything down." He dropped his leather gloves onto the counter and looked around the diner with a critical gaze that made me feel suddenly small, like every crack in the tiles and every stain on the wall was being silently judged. "I'm afraid your place is the only one still open," he muttered, sitting at a corner booth. "Charles Romanov, food critic." The words hit me like a slap. That Charles Romanov, the most feared food critic in the country, famous for his brutal honesty and merciless reviews. Chefs in Moscow whispered his name like a curse, and now, by some cruel twist of fate, he was stranded in my little diner on the edge of nowhere. I tried to keep calm as I poured him tea. My hand shook slightly, the cup rattling on the saucer. "Long way from Moscow," I said. He didn't answer. He only stared out the frosted window at the swirling snow. "My car broke down. Your diner was the first sign of life I've seen in 50 kilometers. I gave a nervous laugh. "Then you're lucky I stayed open." He turned to me with a faint, cold smile. "We'll see if I'm lucky. After I taste your food." The storm roared louder outside. Inside, the real storm was only beginning. The wind outside screamed against the windows as I hurried back into the kitchen. My small diner had survived snowstorms, power cuts, and even a bear once wandering through the back alley, but never a visit from Charles Romanov. I leaned against the counter, breathing hard. What could I possibly serve him? The refrigerator hummed weakly in the corner, half empty after a slow week. Supply trucks hadn't made it through the snow in days. All I had were a few potatoes, onions, some chicken stock, and a bit of dough from this morning. Not exactly the menu of a Moscow restaurant. Still, I had one dish that had never failed me. My babushka's chicken piroshki, small hand pies filled with tender chicken and herbs, brushed with egg yolk until golden. It wasn't fancy, but it was honest. As the smell of baking bread filled the kitchen, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he'd understand that food didn't have to be perfect, just made with care. When I brought the steaming plate to his table, he looked up from his notebook, unimpressed. "What is it?" he asked. "Piroshki," I said softly. "Family recipe." He didn't reply. He simply cut one open with precise, almost surgical movements. The steam rose, carrying the scent of dill and roasted chicken. He took a bite, chewed slowly, and set the fork down. Silence. Every second stretched like an eternity. My palms were sweating. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Finally he spoke, and his voice calm but cutting. "It's edible." Just 2 words, nothing more, nothing less. I felt my throat tighten. Edible. The word echoed in my head like an insult. I had stayed open through the storm, risked my life to make something warm for a stranger, and all I got was edible. He took another bite, slower this time, and began scribbling in his notebook. I turned away, blinking back frustration. Maybe I had expected too much. Maybe critics like him couldn't taste warmth, only perfection. But as I walked back to the kitchen, I didn't notice the small pause in his pen, or the faint flicker of thought crossing his cold grey eyes. Something in that simple pie had stirred him, even if he wasn't ready to admit it yet. The storm outside deepened through the night, howling like wolves in the distance. The power flickered again, plunging Masha's hearth into momentary darkness before the dim emergency lamp glowed to life. Shadows danced on the walls, and the diner felt smaller, quieter, almost intimate. Charles Romanov sat silently at his booth, his long fingers wrapped around a cup of tea I'd just refilled. He hadn't written another word in his notebook for several minutes. His expression had softened, not warm but less sharp, as though the blizzard had scraped away some of his icy exterior. "You make this all yourself?" he finally asked. His voice had lost its edge, replaced by something quieter, maybe curiosity. "Yes," I said, still cautious. "Every morning, just me and my nephew, when he's not at school." He nodded, staring into the amber tea. "Strange," he murmured. "In Moscow, people call themselves chefs, but never touch the food. They bark orders. They plate for cameras. They cook for fame." I smiled faintly. "And you destroy them with words." For a moment I feared I'd gone too far. But instead of anger, he gave a dry laugh, the kind that held more regret than humor. "Someone has to tell the truth," he said, though his eyes drifted toward the snow-covered window. "At least that's what I used to believe." I leaned on the counter. "And now?" He took another bite of the pierogi, slower this time, almost thoughtful. "Now, I'm not sure I remember what the truth tastes like." His words lingered in the air like mist from the tea. The fire in the small stove crackled softly. For the first time, I saw not the ruthless critic who terrified chefs, but a man who'd forgotten what it meant to enjoy something simple. Outside, the wind began to calm, and snowflakes drifted lazily against the window. Inside, the silence between us wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was peaceful. He looked up finally, his eyes meeting mine. "Your mother's recipe, you said?" "Yes," I replied. "She used to say good food doesn't need praise. Just a full stomach and a warm heart." Charles Romanov nodded slowly. "Your mother was a wise woman." And for the first time that night, the great critic smiled. By morning, the blizzard had finally passed. The streets of Velnyovsk lay buried under a fresh blanket of snow, glittering in the pale sunrise. The world looked calm again, as if the storm had never happened. Inside Masha's hearth, the warmth of the wood stove still lingered, carrying the faint scent of baked bread and tea. I was half asleep at one of the booths when the sound of boots on the floor woke me. Charles Romanov stood near the counter, coat buttoned, scarf wrapped neatly around his neck. The hard expression had returned to his face, but now it seemed gentler, less like a mask, and more like armor worn out of habit. "You're leaving already?" I asked, standing up. He nodded. "The roads are clear enough. I called for a mechanic at dawn." He placed a few rubles on the counter, far more than the bill deserved. "That's too much," I protested. "Consider it a correction," he said quietly, almost smiling. He paused at the door, looking back at the little diner, the fogged windows, the flickering lamp, the crooked sign above the stove. "Your place," he said slowly. "It reminds me of something I thought no longer existed." Before I could ask what he meant, he stepped out into the cold, disappearing into the soft white morning. Hours later, after I'd cleaned up and started kneading dough for the next batch, I noticed something on the corner table, a folded napkin with neat handwriting. My name was written on top. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. "In a forgotten town, I found warmth in simplicity. The food here carries no pretense, only heart. It is imperfect but real, and real, I've learned, is rarer than perfection." Charles Romanov, The Moscow Culinary Review. A week later, my diner's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Cars from the city began arriving. Travelers and journalists eager to taste. The food with a soul. The sign above the door, once faded and cracked, now gleamed fresh with new paint. Sometimes, when I serve a customer and see the snow falling outside, I think of that night, of the critic who came as a storm and left as a friend. And I smile because somewhere in Moscow, a man once known for destroying restaurants had written the most beautiful review of his life.